So I'm going to have to do a bit of breathing now to settle myself. But it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm totally excited. And as soon as I got here, I suppose the first thing that one of the first touch encounters I had today was with someone I've not met, called Karen, who came along with someone I have met. And as we approached each other, we just gave each other a hug and kissed each other. Now, I suppose what I'm telling you about this is I want you to turn to the person next to you now, and I want to think about you to think about without being completely inappropriate. And that's the question. How do you completely inappropriately touch the person next to you? So you can do that now. Got a couple of minutes. And the first thing I'm noticing is how hard it is. How hard it is for you to touch this person next to you. How hard is it? Okay, so we've actually, oh, well done. Someone's actually, we've got a little bit of touching going on. Okay, so this is kind of what I'm trying to say, you know? Like, there's lots of rules. There's lots of rules about how we can touch each other. And partly with me and Karen, we were negotiating a kind of understanding of, I was like, okay, so she's with Bruna. Bruna's from Brazil. I think this woman's from Brazil. Okay, she's coming towards me. Okay, I'll get right in there and we'll do the kissing thing. So, these kind of imaginations about technologies and how we connect in this kind of unreal or differently real world are going to be based on all of these kinds of experiences that we have as a kind of interdisciplinary people. And we've already kind of heard, and the whole conference is based around this idea of how important touch is for us as humans. And how, not just in this kind of interpersonal way, but how we communicate to know ourselves, not just in a sexual, sensual way, but to know ourselves, to know, I guess, as Anna may be talking about, like to know how we are, to gain information about ourselves and gain information about the world more generally, how we kind of work with tools and how we pick up things, how we interact with objects to gain information about the world and our place in it as well. And so when we start kind of thinking like this, and that really has to expand our understanding of what communication is. We can't think about communication purely as being this like linguistic event. So we have to think about our bodies. And we have to think about how our bodies come into how we talk with one another as well. And so this kind of stretches a bit our understanding of what communication is. And that's what I'm interested in. I guess over the last kind of 15 years or so, my research has been about how we communicate or how our bodies are always with us, and how they're really a central part of the ways in which we communicate with one another. And so I've looked a lot at kind of gesture, I've looked a lot at movements in everyday social interactions, and that's brought me to look at touch. And partly why I've come to look at touch is this kind of ebb and flow of where touch is in our communicational landscape, and being interested in how technologies in particular change the configurations of modes. And I suppose I just want to look back a little bit, because I think when we're all engaged in looking at technologies, we can all be like, oh, you know, like always looking forward. But I think in communication, we need to understand this context and understand the ways that things get configured by social interactions, and by the social of which technology is one part. It's never kind of obviously separate. So in 15th century Europe, touch had a different place in our communicational, or in the communicational landscape, than it does right now, this moment. So imagine, you know, like the movement of people was very different, transport was very different, kinship relationships therefore were very different, what cities were was different. The kind of closeness of people physically. I mean, I'm not saying that the world is a flat landscape and all of these differences are the same. So I'm talking about like an imagination of Europe in that moment. So, you know, like noble people, noble men slept with their servants, not in a sexual way, though I'm sure sometimes it was. But so there was a kind of sense of kind of physical closeness that perhaps in Western Europe doesn't happen. Even co-sleeping with your baby is kind of controversial now, which is interesting in terms of like skin relationships. But also health was different. There was like a lot of religious practice that involved ingesting, kind of putting objects in your mouth. Legal arrangements were sealed with a kiss because of the kind of idea of the soul being in your breath. By like the late 19th century, after kind of various like enormous kind of health pandemics, people were starting to wear gloves. There was a kind of change in travel. There was a rise in the notion of individual, which kind of created, I suppose, like tactile boundaries between people, and the rise of this idea of like tactophobia, which people kind of think of something connected to digital technologies often now. And then by the 20th century, Constance Classen, who's like a bit of a hero of mine, who's written about the sensory history of touch, says that touch had more or less been ousted. And she links that to the rise of visual ocular technologies, and links that with the idea of the display of capitalism and the equation of touch going to this kind of primitive base place. So we need to kind of situate our imaginations of touch in the context of personal relationships in a kind of moment of now then, which is kind of theme of this conference. So we're either not touching enough, or we're touching too much. So there's this basically tensions between where touch is in our landscape. And I think it's interesting to kind of look at these media debates and concerns about what touch is now, and where that kind of fits into the way we communicate. But there's also very kind of politically uneven in thinking about whose touch matters. So there's been a number of court cases in the UK of late that have talked about the inadequacy of visual technologies such as Skype in parenting contexts. So there's been custody battles in which people have not been allowed to move to another country because the father would then be have a non-tactile relationship with their child. So this kind of idea that you can't parent over Skype, you can't be physically in contact over Skype, and therefore the kind of notion of technologies not being good enough to maintain relationships. But there's equally been court cases in which Skype as a visual technology has been held up as something that black men can do if they're going to be deported by the UK government to Jamaica. So there's kind of uneven political landscape of whose touch matters and when touch matters in terms of like parental relationships. So we can kind of think then that this contemporary social conditions around where touch is, just as in the 15th century had a place, it now has this changing place around shifts in the social relationships that we're engaged in, the changing ideas of migration and the labour market that require people to be separated in different kinds of ways, about family reconfigurations through either separation or life choices, but also like the power of technologies. So we kind of can understand these material and affordances of digital touch to be part of a very big landscape. And I suppose that's my kind of desire is to highlight the sociality of this landscape. And I'll quote my colleague David, who'll be talking later. I think this is a fantastic quote, and really about putting the kind of idea that these technologies are trying to give what he calls a tactility, give tactility a new use in the political economy of sensation through these sensing bodies. I think it's a really, really powerful. So thank you. And so I'm just going to whiz through this landscape, which I think will be sketched out better by others today. So we've got the kind of a whole range of haptic technologies for personal communication, including these funny little kissing machines, I'm at the kind of, I suppose what could say, the polite end of the sex spectrum that's going to be unrolled today as well. We've got wearables, including Keith Huisman's product Hey, which designed to put remote couples into kind of contact through enabling them to create touch sensations and communicate with each other. We've got sensing inputs via skin, turning, also we've been working on my project with some electronic paints that you can draw on skin to operate different devices, but also this new little market of biosensing and babies and touch that's emerging, which we're interested in how that's going to impact on parent-infant touch. And I'll just very quickly play you this video, if I can work out how to do that. Oh, no. I can't work out how to start that from this. Yeah. It doesn't matter, actually. Okay, I'll just move on. Yeah. So this is a screen grab from. Is anyone familiar with Facebook Spaces? Okay, so it's this new thing. So Facebook has bought Oculus Rift, which is a virtual touch, I suppose, environment. And so if you can look at it now if you want to on your phones or whatever. So if you just search Facebook Spaces. And what it is a virtual environment it's like the idea of a room in which you virtually come together. It takes 5 to 10 images, most recently taken on your Facebook page, and it creates a three-dimensional avatar for you, which then you can basically move around and go to different spaces. You can tap into 360 videos from anywhere in the world and plonk yourself into these spaces together. And you can also draw and make and hand one another objects within it. So it's bringing this sense of sharing and touching things together into that virtual space. So all of that kind of landscape then is shaping our communicational, our social, and the communicational landscape in socially and politically significant kinds of ways. It's changing or influencing what can be touched, but also contexts of touch, who can touch and whose touch begins to matter or whose touch is emphasized. And it's also impacting on impact on touch practices and norms within those spaces. So my question for me then, as a social scientist, coming from sociology, but originally coming from fine arts as well, is how do I research this thing? So my experience so far is there's no point talking to people about how they touch. Well, not no point, but it's very limited, the kind of data that I get as a social scientist if I ask people about their touch practices. So let's just do another little experiment together. So I want you to, with the person sitting next to you, I want you to tell them about the best handshake you've had recently. Okay, you haven't got long, because I haven't got long, so come on. Okay. Okay, so now I want you to right, so quite a lot of you have already started doing this. Hello. So quite a lot of you have already started doing this, but what I want you to do is give the person next to you the best handshake you've had recently. Okay, so have I managed to make my point? Okay, so I hope I've managed to make my point. It's really lovely that you're all enjoying touching each other so much. So I think it's really, it seems easier for people to explain touch or through experiencing touch. You can then it provokes a conversation or enables a conversation, but having a shared touch experience like that is an interesting way, I think, to start to explore what touch is, and it seems to get somewhere different. And I guess for me then, touch feels, compared to some of the other like embodied interactions that I've explored, it seems quite hard for people to access like touch experiences. I'm not fully sure why that is. Partly it's language, so I'm completely excited to have this copy of the taxonomy, and partly I think in terms of digital touch, it's very much about a future-facing experience for many of us. So I'm talking like beyond the kind of touch screen in a way. So this idea of like feeling rather than trying to recount, and using touch to research touch I'll just talk about for the rest of my time with you. And I think we're also, I suppose, in my work more generally, trying to get away from thinking that everything can be, I suppose, told or recounted through language. And partly that's from my arts background and knowing myself. I suppose partly, I feel quite inarticulate when I talk often. I find it much easier to write, for example. But also the idea that within social science, touch is very neglected. I mean, there's a lot in psychology, there's a lot in philosophy, thanks to Mark. And when the work that I'm particularly aware of is very quantitative within computer science and HCI, very, very kind of connecting HCI and computer science and engineer with psychology and psychophysics. Well, that kind of work doesn't get where I want to get to. I want to understand something much more socially orientated. So I'm trying to listen to or feel touch and listen to bodies and explore it that way. So in a way, then, what I'm saying is like to get to these experiences at the edge of, it's not that they're not central, but they're a bit marginal in how we talk about I think our kind of experience of communication, that we need these inventive methods. And so Celia Lurie and Nina Wakeford have talked about that as needing research to become a more active engagement with this idea of a changing world. And so that we don't kind of try and look at something we're not trying to look at these static realities, but we're trying to investigate a more kind of contingent and sensuous type of experience. And how we're doing that in this ImTouch project I've got, which is a European Research Commission funded Consolidator Award to explore digital touch communication, is by looking at the interrelations and the entanglements of people, technologies, and environments. And we're mobilizing 3 different research lenses to do that. The work of multimodality, which is I suppose, a theory that I've been involved in developing with Günter Kress and various other people, which gives this micro-semiotic lens on what touch is, like what kind of resources there are, what kind of parameters are involved, and tries to kind of map what touch can be in different social situations and contexts. And then bringing in the work of sensory ethnography, building on the work of Sarah Pink, which gives a much kind of broader social cultural lens to think about what touch is and where it's coming from. And then overlaying that with a much more kind of experimental lens coming from arts-based methods. So we're kind of using the multimodal lens to generate this fine-grained account of digital touch alongside these other methods. And this range of methods is around all of them. What they've got in common is trying to look beyond language and trying to develop innovative methods. So I'll just talk briefly about a workshop that we ran, which was around using experience prototyping with a range of people, master's students coming from London School of Economics, Sociology, Media and Communications, Royal College of Art, Design and Fashion, the UCL Linguistics and Computer Science, and Birkbeck University's linguistics students. So we ran 3 very intensive workshops, and we gave them a whole range of materials, and we gave them a whole range of touch words that we'd brainstormed that they could kind of attach their things, and we brought in a couple of facilitators, one from UCL's Institute of Making, and who's experienced in doing rapid prototyping design, and another from the Royal College of Art, who does, I suppose, tactile soft robotics, and who has a background in running experience design workshops. So we were interested then in, like, how can we use these workshops to generate some socially orientated ideas about people's imaginations of remote personal communication using digital touch. And I'll just very quickly show you some of the prototypes, and then I'll talk about 4 themes, so more socially orientated themes that we got from these things. So there's a chair in which you create a whole sensory environment which basically sends and records body messages. So it's kind of inflatable. Obviously, these are kind of rough knock-ups. They're conceptual. We're not going to be marketing that one next week. This idea of like connecting people through wearables it was described as having a mouse, like when you've got a mouse in your house, you know it's there, but you never see it. So this sense of like an ongoing presence together, like connecting up, in this case, 5 people. Basically a touch cape that could be send and receive messages. And this is a kind of virtual reality thing that kind of rushes into your aura, if you like, as an emotion that's sent to you from somebody that you can feel their emotion. You can literally feel not literally, but virtually feel the emotion that person's having. Now, these are not in and of themselves especially interesting, per se. What it is the kinds of discussions that making these objects enable people to have, and the kinds of insights into thinking about touch and their imaginations of touch. So one of which is around people's thinking around the redesigned communicative affordances and properties of touch. So one thing we noticed quite a few different things, like noted up here, and one I'll just pull out is around the reconfiguration of explicit and implicit digital touch, and became very interested to think about some forms, some aspects of communication, like emotions, may be very implicit, but through these ideas of digital touch, people were making them very explicit. So if you imagine communication or touch on a kind of continuum of implicit to explicit, then what people were using these technologies to do was to reconfigure that, to make some very implicit things very explicit, and in reverse, to make some explicit forms of communication much more implied. And I think that's a kind of interesting thought about how digital technologies can transform the character of touch in that way. Also this idea of sending and sharing tactile experiences at distance, and being able to share this new thing of like a digital body message, and what that kind of questions that rose for people was like, how do you interpret touch in these digital contexts when your bodies are separated, which is something that's really key to, I think, a lot of the talks today. So those changed tools, if you like, create changes in the touch skills and capacities that people imagine we're going to need for this space. And so one of those is around kind of I'll just show this in the back. So one of them is around kind of how you think about, as interaction designers, as this person is, how you think about mapping touch sensations to the body. And why for us as social scientists these prototyping sessions became very interesting was the ways in which people had to use their bodies to think about touch, and in doing so, how that kind of created dilemmas for them. So how were they going to create touch experiences that featured parts of their bodies they couldn't touch? And that became really intriguing. Quite a lot of the scenarios. And so then they started to create symbolic gestures that enabled them to send different kinds of touch that they couldn't experience. So it's these kind of things, but also to think about the boundaries of feeling between themselves and others, which raise many kind of questions about social practices, norms, and rules. So as we kind of experience when we try to touch, or I asked you to touch somebody next to you, touching is a very touchy subject. It's a very rule-bound topic or practice, and so the question of like what strategies we need to manage these norms in these new environments became very, very heightened in the discussion. So one such thing was the idea of what touch politeness and what kind of sensory values we need to operate in this context. It's a bit like on Skype, like when you're trying to talk to somebody, and it's very hard because it's harder to interrupt somebody on Skype than it is when you're having a face-to-face conversation, because some of the cues aren't quite there. So how do you work out touch practice and turn-taking in a kind of digital touch environment when the other person's body might not be present at the same time as yours is? So these kind of protocols around imagining the temporality of digital touch and became really problematic in thinking about this idea of personal remote communication. And also kind of very gendered and, I suppose very, very gendered discussions around initiation and response around touch in these digital environments. So when you showed your the sex toys kind of image, and we talk about this really exciting new space, what I saw was like an immensely heterosexual marketing kind of campaign with a taller man with a smaller woman leaning on him, completely emulating the 1979 Irving Goffman's gender advertisements idea of a feminine touch. So it's like, so these kind of norms, I suppose, I'm interested in what kinds of norms are just going to carry straight on through, and how we might, in our kind of queering of this digital space of touch, want to think about how we resist and disrupt some of those kind of norms as well. And I guess that's some of the things people are playing around with in these workshops. But it's also interesting just methodologically thinking about in those, just as we And I too would find it hard to just turn around somebody, maybe you're sitting next to someone you don't know, to just turn around and touch them, because it's so personal. And also I might not want to touch them for lots of my own reasons as well, or might not want to be touched. So all of those issues are there. But also in the workshops, what we were seeing was that when we've got mixed gendered groups working around this idea of touch, we could see gender and sexuality playing out, and the kind of problems the challenges of working across or touching across different cultural experiences. So as a method, we have to, as researchers, be really sensitive to that, just as we as designers do as well. So we're working with very international groups and exploring, therefore, like these prototyping sessions enable us to explore people's kind of historical and cultural relationships, personal histories and relationships to touch, which can be a very ethically challenging thing to do as well. Obviously, many of us have been hit as children or have had experienced violent touch in lots of different ways, either as children or as adults. And in these kind of contexts, thinking about touch and working together in groups around touch, those kind of experiences emerge, and we have to deal with them as researchers. And that brings me to kind of ethics and the ethics of touch. And there was much around kind of ethics that emerged through these workshops. And a really interesting tension for me was around this ambiguity of touch and this idea of sending and feeling, but also around consent and control. So there's ideas around, one of our participants has various I suppose, medical conditions that can make it very painful for her to be touched, in particular, depending on what day and how her health is doing. So that kind of sense of whether or not you can block touch. So just kind of drawing on the ways in which visual technologies have changed the way in which we communicate. So thinking about social media, thinking about the ways that we send images to one another now, often with no writing, or send little short videos or whatever to one another. So thinking about sending touches and like whether or not how we'd block them, or whether or not we could, or could we manipulate them, could we turn them up? Can we make them more intense or less intense? And how will we Instagram filter our touch, if you like? And so thinking through those things caused lots of argument. No, you're going to get the touch that I'm going to give you. You can't, everything can't be pleasant. You know, so these kind of questions around who's in control of what pleasure is, obviously a very big and very current and very political topic for us all, always, but many people realising more recently for everybody. So this, but also this sense of touch permission and touch ownership wasn't just about either self-regulation or kind of governance in a kind of technological environment, but also ideas around with a lot of the different prototypes, this idea of like, well, actually, I sent that person this body message, but I've split up with them now, and I want them to delete that body message, but they keep playing the body message back. And actually now they're dating someone else, and that someone else is getting my body messages because they keep sitting in the chair and playing them to them. So now I feel like I'm in a relationship with my ex and my ex's new partner because they're all using my body in this way. So how do you kind of own your body and how do you own touch, and what touch is became this really interesting question through the workshops. So just to leave time for, hopefully for us to have some kind of touch or some kind of conversation, this is my last slide, and I suppose I hope that I've illustrated that somehow or other, like through exploring touch and through bodies and trying to listen to or feel our our participants' bodies, that we've kind of engaged with the materiality and physicality of prototyping within this social science frame. That's enabled us to explore their socially orientated felt explorations and imaginations of this area that is very kind of future-facing, so we can't, as social scientists, go and see how it's been domesticated. We can't go as we normally would into someone's life and lived world and observe what they're doing. So we're involved in a different kind of endeavour. And here's some information if you want to kind of follow us or find out more about the bigger project. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carey. So if you have any questions, now would be a good time. We have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So feel free, and you'll have to wait for the microphone to come to you.
Or you can just come and give me a hug.
Hello. So, Carey, I'll try to formulate maybe together with you, because I never thought about this before. Mm-hmm. But as you know, in my research, I'm looking at how people touch textiles and how does that influence the creative process and all of these things. And also how to mediate the feeling. But, okay, so if we go back to the now hold my hand, like shake hands, and then you put those questions. What if I don't want to be touched, or if I don't want to touch?
Yeah.
So in my studies with textiles, that distinction is really hard to make. Like, it's very entangled. And you know how the touching and being touched is almost a simultaneous thing, which is also what Merleau-Ponty says, that this experience of touching, being touched is something that you can't really distinguish, because it's always this double sensation.
Yeah. The duality of touch.
Which is in a time frame of presence. But now we're talking about digital, and what happens to that? It's just like suddenly that is not so straightforward. So I don't even know what my question is, but I just was puzzled with this, with why we're speaking, because suddenly it's like, okay, but that touching and being touched is not the same, it's just not so straightforward. The duality in the physical presence is one thing, but what happens in the digital is very interesting to think about the time aspect, really.
Yeah.
And the synchronicity or asynchronicity.
Yeah, and I suppose, I mean, other of the speakers know much more about this than me, and I'm sure they'll be talking about it. But my sense is that a lot of work around digital touch, or in the context of talking about it as haptics, has been about kind of reducing all that latency and that kind of time lag and blah, 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 to get like this sense of I am touching you and you are touching me, and it is this kind of mutual exchange. But I think obviously like that's about, I suppose, trying to make people or give people the experience of being in the same place and time together, and goes back to like the paper that Mark mentioned that he wrote, that I've just finished reading again, like he wrote in 2006. 2006, yeah. So about presence and absence and these things. But the kind of, when I'm looking at digital touch in that sense, I kind of see a real opportunity, and I don't know what it will be, just to completely separate out the sending and the receiving, and that creates completely different questions about consent, about about what a touch experience is, or even what touch is. So I think it kind of really questions that. Yeah. But in another way, it's so old-fashioned because it's a bit like just sending someone a phone message. I mean, it's not. It's kind of tangled up with things we've all done before, you know. I don't know the answer, but in that sense of not wanting to be touched or not wanting to touch, I suppose the digital becomes a very different arena for people. And I think the digital's also used a lot at the moment in terms of trying to what could you say, like sensitize people to what the norm of touch is. So like re-enabling people to touch again in the kind of normative expectation of that. But maybe, maybe there'll be different kind of continuums that we can sit on more comfortably around what touching is or isn't. And in the world, internationally, like in China, the people that I work with tell me, like you wouldn't touch them. You wave at your friends to say hello. Like if you're next to each other, you don't touch hands. I don't think that's like a lack. It's a cultural, social decision. So I suppose it's about understanding touch around the planet and seeing that not as like hot or cold or good or bad, but understanding what function touch has, what meaning functions it has in our worlds. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have a few minutes left. So this lady.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I was asking if touching is have a lot of different phases. In the way you talk about China, and I chat with someone from there, and he touched me to send me always photos about the sky. So every day a photo about the sky, and that feels as a touch. And maybe that is his only way to do it on this moment.
On Skype, I guess it is, yeah.
Not only on phone.
On the phone, also,
Yes.
yeah. I mean, there are obviously. I was, in a way, it's a bit of a confession, but I'm not sure I really know what touch is. I'm not really sure where I'm drawing the boundaries around it, and the digital makes that very confusing for me. So there is a whole load of, obviously work and around the visuality of touch, and there's quite been a lot written around the visuality of touch. I, as a researcher, am not interested in my work in the visuality of touch. I'm interested in touch more as a sensory experience that is rooted in something physical around touch or something sensory around touch. So I'm bracketing out that visuality of touch in my work, which isn't to dismiss it. It's just not what I'm looking at in this particular project. But there's a lot written around that and the visuality of paintings and also, in terms of affect and touch, that if you were to burn your hand, I may well feel, if I'm watching you, I may feel that. I may, so it's not that there is that kind of very strong kind of connection between our bodies with one another and experiences of pain or pleasure or whatever, and that's done visually, but it's not what I'm looking at.
Yes, but you are talking about if you like to touch or not. So I will see this beginning. These clouds are the beginning of to introduce a meeting where you can touch each other. But I don't say that it is nothing.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's nothing. But yeah, I suppose there is maybe it's not different. There's different classifications of what you'd put into the kind of realm of touch. But I'm not sure if I'd go with the idea that you progress from one thing to another. I think that, because the problem for me with that is it would make it like a lack, or that someone's got an immature relationship to touch, that they do touch visually, or I don't know. So I would want to kind of disrupt that idea of progress of touch and disrupt because it's a bit normalizing, or I would want to disrupt that a little bit. But it's interesting to think, maybe it's for all of us can think, like, what are we including and excluding? I mean, they're important decisions around what we include or exclude from either what communication is or what touch is, and I think you've raised an interesting point in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so I think we ought to take a break there. It just as a kind of little glimpse of the future of touch, Professor Jewitt is working also on a project with tactile emoji. So I think that's, when we think about protocols about touch, I mean, I hate emoji. I think there's so much time and developmental effort put to, in terms of operating systems, emoji. But a tactile emoji, I could maybe get behind. I mean, that kind of presence and protocol and things like that. But anyway, we have to take a break now. So let's put our hands together for Professor Carey Jewitt.